Well, Ryan, this is your dad. You asked me to tell you some of the stories of my life, and I thought I would start out with my adventure in Italy. Um, we had decided that we were going to be in the travel business, and we were trying to interest some people from the Midwest to look at some properties that we represented in Europe. And so we had flown into Nice, France, and we were staying at a place called Marina Bay des Anges, beautiful property that was owned by the company that we were working for at the time. We had about 15 people from Iowa and Illinois with us on that trip, and I was trying to play sort of the host and show the people a good time, and therefore interest them in investing in some of the properties that we represented. And so on this particular day, I had checked ahead of time, and we were going to go through Monaco on our way into Italy and go to a town of San Ramon, which was on the Italian coast, or the Italian Riviera. It was a small town, and I had heard that they had a flea market. And so we had all rented cars. I think there was 4 cars that we had rented, and we drove over more or less as a caravan to San Ramon. And we drove around the small town trying to find a place to park. And when you don't speak the language, you sometimes are a little confused as to where to park. I'm usually very cautious about where I park when I'm traveling because I don't want to have my car towed and go through the confusion and the problems with that. So I parked safely in a parking place and paid the fee to park there. And we went through this flea market. It was really interesting. I remember this one particular incident. On the flea market, this guy comes up to us, and they had a trench coat on, and he opens the trench coat up, and it was just lined with expensive watches or fakes of the expensive watches, and say, hey, you need some? um, Either they were stolen or they were fake because they were really cheap. I didn't buy any. We spent an hour and a half there. It was a lot of fun. I think some of the people bought some trinkets there in San Ramon. It was an old town, had a lot of old buildings, and as we were going back to our car, we had to pass where one of the other guys had parked his car. His name was Robert Moore, and he owned a famous bar in Rock Island, Illinois, and so and he was a wealthy man, and there were a bunch of policemen next to his vehicle, and so when I thought maybe this is a problem, and so I asked in my English Spanish accent what was going on, and they asked if it was my car, and I didn't know exactly what to say. I said, well, I can be responsible for it, and then right away they got very huffy to me. Bob Moore stayed in the background because I said I would handle it, being the person in charge. And they said, well, you're going to need to come down to the police station with us. And so they took me to the police station, and once we got inside, one particular of the officers became very belligerent and threatened me right away that this was going to be very, very expensive because I was an American and we had taken the parking spot that belonged to the police department. And I told him that I was sorry, and again, Spanish, English, and but he would have nothing of it. And so it was an old building, and you went up steps to get into the building, and so it was like a level up from the street level. And straight ahead there was a holding cell with bars and everything on it. And he told me, well, he took me there and he said, "You're in here," and he slammed the door and he said, "You're going to pay." And he took my passport at that time and went away, and I think to left me stew. Well, one of the people that was with us was a real estate agent named Lois McMorrin. Lois was a rather large woman, very confident. She was the kind that wore bright red lipstick, and she was very outspoken and very forward. And she came bursting into the police department. And of course, she didn't speak Italian, but she wasn't going to be stopped until she came into the cell where I was, and she sort of shooed him out. She was just that kind of person. And she said, "Well, what are they doing?" And I said, "Well, they're holding me because of where Bob parked his car." And she says, "Oh, that's too bad." She says, "What's it going to cost?" And I said, "Well, I don't know yet." I said, "They're talking about it being a substantial fine, but I don't like to pay substantial fines when I think it's just a hoax." And she said, "Well, I understand that." And she says, "Is there anything that you need to get rid of?" And I said, "Well, they already took my passport, but I have quite a bit of money on me because we're traveling as a group." And so I gave her almost all of my money. I saved 10,000 Italian lira, a US dollar, and a British pound. And that was all the money that I had left in my billfold. And she took the rest of it and left. And in about another 15 or 20 minutes, he came back and told me that I had to contribute to the Widows and Orphans Fund. And I said, "Well, how much is the fine?" And he said, "It's going to be several $100s." And I said, I don't pay those kind of monies. I said, "It's certainly not a fine." Again, this communication was Spanish, English, Italian mixed. And he got very, very agitated because I wasn't going to cooperate. And he talked about how us Americans were so arrogant that we didn't think we had to pay for services that they were providing and that they needed. And so he threatened me, said that he would take me out, and that there would be one more sad American family when I returned to the United States. And I was stubborn enough that I wasn't buying into it. And he said, "Well, you're going to leave?" And I said, "Well, when I leave," I said, "there's a whole crowd of Americans with me." He hadn't recognized that, evidently, when we came in. And I said, "And they will tell the American consulate that I've been taken prisoner by you, and there will be trouble." And he said, again, he got all excited at me and said, "That's the way you Americans are. You're a bunch of blowhards." And so he took me, he grabbed me by the arm and started yanking me to go out. And I came out the door, top of the steps, and all the people that were with us were standing at the bottom of the steps. I'd been in there for maybe an hour and a half, and they were getting concerned. And they all started yelling at me, "What's going on?" And then he realized that I had been telling him the truth, and that there was a bunch of people that he had to deal with. And so instead of taking me away, and he said that I wouldn't return, he decided to take me back inside. But then, of course, he was really agitated because his plan to scare me more hadn't worked. And he put me back in the cell again. And then he moved me to another room to interrogate me, and he kept trumping up charges and saying that the group that I was with, and that I was a part of a gangster group that was trying to steal stuff in the flea market, and all kinds of charges that just didn't make any sense or weren't relevant. and he threatened prosecution, and every once in a while he'd get somebody else to come in and they'd say something and they'd confer, and then he'd shake his head and they'd leave, and so it went on probably for an hour, pretty intense interrogation with this guy. And then he got me out in the hall and he was yelling at me, repeatedly threatening me. And about this time, an Italian businessman came into the police department. I don't know if he had said anything to the group waiting down below or not, but I was standing facing the door, and between me and the door was this policeman who was interrogating me, and he was pretty loud and yelling at me. And so the Italian businessman who was standing there was the only other person in the hall when this guy was yelling questions at me, and most of them at this time I didn't understand because he was getting very agitated because he hadn't gotten any money out of me. I don't know why he hadn't taken my billfold to find out that I didn't have money, but I just assumed that he thought I did. And so he would ask a question, and the Italian businessman would either shake his head yes or no. And I thought, well, I haven't got anything to lose. And so I was saying yes and no based on what this Italian businessman was sort of giving me the clue to do. And this went on for maybe 5 or 10 minutes of this conversation. And he finally just became very frustrated that he wasn't going to get anything out of me. He finally asked for my billfold, and the Italian businessman is seeing it all. And he's standing there just looking like, with a look of disgust. And then he took me into a room and again took that money, which amounted to about $8, by the way. And he took that money, and then he said, just get out of here. You know, he says, you need to leave right now. And he gave me my passport back, but I said, well, you took my money. I said, you haven't even given me a ticket. And I thought, well, if he's going to do this to me, I'm going to at least have evidence of who this guy is, because by this time I was pretty mad. And so he wrote me out a ticket, and I still have it to this day. I used to have it framed in my office, and I still have that ticket to this day. And so I left, and he said that we as a group had an hour to get out of the country and never return. I don't know if that's still the case. I haven't been back to Italy since. But I took him seriously. I knew that he could cause trouble. And so I told all the people, once we got out, I said, you got to take your cars and you need to follow me, and we need to get out of Italy. Well, the rest of the trip, Bob Moore, who owned a company, the bar was called Lee's Liquors, but he owned a lot more than that in that industry. It was a sort of a college place for Augustana people, I think. But anyway, the rest of the vacation, Bob Moore, who always had a roll of $100 bills in his pocket, I just couldn't buy anything. I mean, he bought everything for me. He told me, he said, hey, had they taken me in there, he said, I'd have given them a whole roll of hundreds. He said, so you saved me a lot of trouble. And he says, they probably would have hurt me besides. And he said, you really took the pressure for me. And I said, well, thank you. I said, I appreciate it, but that was just me doing my job. But, my meals, he picked up my meals and everything for the rest of the trip. And it was exciting the rest of the trip. We took a Russian hydrofoil over to the northern tip of Africa. We went to the Kasbah, and there in Morocco. The Russian hydrofoil died right in the Straits of Gibraltar. It was an airboat, and the motors died, and the boat started to sink. The air was going out of it. I don't think it was actually going to go down, but eventually, I mean, it looked like a piece of junk. and eventually we made it over there. Had a fantastic time in Morocco, um, riding camels and seeing all the different sites of northern Africa, and then just the whole trip was amazing. But we got back to the United States, and Bob Moore said that he wanted to make it up to me, and again I tried to be humble about it and said no, it was just me doing my job. And I said, I should have, well, at least I got this ticket out of it. And he looked at it and he says, well, you got the name of the guy who was harassing you the whole time? I said, yeah, that's him. And so he said, well, let me see if I can at least report these authorities over there and see if they can't make sure this doesn't happen to another American. I said, okay. And so he wrote his name down. And I didn't hear anything for a long time, probably 2 or 3 months, and Bob Moore finally called me and said, hey, why don't you come on in, and I've got something to show you. So I came in to his office, and he had a newspaper, and it was an Italian newspaper, and of course I don't read Italian, and so I didn't know what it said. He said, well, what do you think of that? And he showed me a part of the newspaper. I said, I don't recognize anything. He said, well, do you recognize that name? And I said, no, I don't. He said, that's the name of the guy on your ticket. I says, it is? I said, well, did he get in trouble? He said, well, I don't know if he's gotten in trouble or not, but that's his obituary. I said, what? And he said, well, I don't know that he's actually dead, but what happened was, he said, I didn't tell you this, but I'm the largest importer in the state of Illinois of Italian wines. And so I told the Italians that I wasn't going to import any Italian wine until they corrected this problem with this gentleman. And he says, so I don't know whether they just put this in the newspaper to satisfy me. He says, but I certainly didn't tell them that he needed to become one of the his wife would become one of the widows and his children become orphans for that fund that he was trying to extract from you. So I doubt that it really happened, knowing the circumstances, but at least in the local newspaper, his obituary was, and it was sent to him, the newspaper was sent to him by the Italian wine companies that he had quit doing business with. So that's part of that adventure, Ryan, of my Italian don't pay bribes business. In future times, I will tell you about some times when I had to pay a bribe, or someone would have been eliminated in Mexico one time, and then another time in Vietnam when it was necessary. I had always been opposed. I thought it was wrong. I still think it's wrong to pay a blackmail. But I will explain to you another time why I did what I did when I paid a bribe to get someone out of jail who was working for us.